Today I'm beginning a brand new video series on a brand new topic, and this new topic is a new departure for me. It's something that I've never done a talk on before and that I haven't written a lot about in even my books. So this is really new content and I hope you'll enjoy it. I hope you'll come along and watch the videos. The topic is the intersection of the reliability of the Gospels with reports of the miraculous. So it's a question of historical methodology. And today's video is going to be a little bit longer. It's a setup video where I'm laying out the kind of approach that I'm going to be taking. And then we'll start looking at specific miracle reports in the next video. There are two types of problems that we want to avoid when we start thinking about reports of the miraculous in a document like the Gospels. And I want to say right here that I'm talking here about treating the Gospels as historical records. I'm not saying that they're not inspired by God. I think they were inspired by God. But for purposes of this methodological discussion, I'm saying suppose we were to treat them simply as historical records. What would be a good and a reasonable approach to take without bringing in an assumption about their nature theologically, that they were, for example, divinely inspired? Still, how can we be reasonable in approaching them as historical records that claim to report miracles? And there are two types of problems that we want to avoid. The first is being too skeptical. Non-Christian skeptics will use the phrase, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. On the face of it, that sounds kind of reasonable. But when you investigate it, you often find out what they mean by that is, when it comes to a miracle claim, no evidence is ever going to be enough. David Hume very famously said that no testimonial evidence could ever be sufficient to establish a miracle. And he has many followers today. So the idea there is that some natural explanation is always going to be the better explanation. Well, that seems obviously wrong. By that approach, you could never be reasonably convinced historically that a miracle had happened. And even by testimony, and some have admitted that even if it occurred before their very eyes. So that seems closing yourself to the possibility of evidence, and that's blocking the path of inquiry. There's another way to be too skeptical, which is to say that all that we can know as historians is that Jesus did acts that were taken to be miraculous, or that he was known as a miracle worker, but that we would be going beyond what the data warrant in order to say that any particular miracle actually occurred and actually was a miracle. We can't say that as historians. Maybe we can only say it as Christians, whatever exactly that means. Let me just point out here that if you did take that approach there, it would be on principle to make an exception for the resurrection. Even if you said that there was a lot more evidence for the resurrection, well, in theory, there could be a lot of evidence for some miracle other than the resurrection as well. So there's no principal distinction there. You have to be willing to break down that kind of methodological naturalism as applied to miracles, including miracles reported in the Gospels, and say, yes, historical evidence can lead us to affirm it or assert it. So that's the overly skeptical approach. On the other hand, we want to avoid an overly credulous approach. G.K. Chesterton once said that if you believe an old apple woman about a murder, you should believe her about a miracle. Now that's very Chestertonian, miracle, murder. He liked to use alliteration. But I don't think I agree with Chesterton there, where he is essentially saying that we shouldn't treat different things differently. If the apple woman is credible, and if we believe her about other things like murders or presumably apples, we should just believe her. If she says that she saw a man raised from the dead, we should just say, oh, well, I guess she saw a man raised from the dead. That seems to me to be a little too simple. Even within natural events, we make distinctions as to those natural statements that are better justified or less well justified, even from a credible source. So, for example, if you have a credible history that tells you that a battle took place at a certain place at a certain time, you will give more credence to that than if that same source tries to tell you what the motive was of a certain general for engaging in battle at that place and time, because you recognize that that statement about motive is an inference. It's a further inference, even though it's not a miracle statement. So we need to make distinctions. And the apple woman might be more readily mistaken if she attests to a miracle than if she attests to a murder. So I'm going to be examining these miracle accounts and giving you some individual examples. But I've also said that we need to take a holistic approach to the Gospels, and we need to take gospel reliability very seriously and not just become agnostic on a passage by passage, detail by detail basis. So I don't want to be doing that. I'm not saying, hey, when we get to the miracles, reliability has nothing to tell us anymore. That's not true. We should not develop amnesia about all the other evidence that we have about a gospel and it's being reliable when we get to a report of a miracle and throw up our hands and say we don't know. We don't want to do that. We want to be able to use our evidence, if we have independent evidence, that that gospel is reliable. Now, you can see how this would work best in particular examples, which I'll be doing in the coming weeks. But I also want to show it by giving you 4 reasons why we should examine in more detail, subject to somewhat more scrutiny, the reports that we find of miracles in the Gospels and how this might go. The first reason is one of prior probability. While we should not take the skeptic's lie that the prior probability of a miracle is infinitesimally low and that therefore it's just impossible or virtually impossible to overcome it, it's reasonable to acknowledge that miracles are not just absolutely common. After all, if everyone were rising from the dead all the time, then a resurrection from the dead could not serve as a sign of special divine favor. If you announced that Jesus rose from the dead and that meant that God had endorsed his teaching, what if everybody were rising from the dead so that your audience said, yeah, my Uncle Fred rose from the dead last week, and my Aunt Judy rose from the dead the week before that. It's no big deal. So in a sense, we need to acknowledge that miracles have a somewhat low prior probability in order for them to act as signs. So the prior probability is a reason for us to subject an account of a miracle to somewhat more scrutiny. And you would do this even with a friend that you trusted. Now we can bring in other considerations about the prior. We can bring in, for example, the character of Jesus, as discussed in my friend Tom Gilson's book, Too Good to Be False, which came out recently. We can show, for example, that Jesus doesn't appear to have been a charlatan who was attempting to fake miracles in order to gain power or money for himself. We can also use C.S. Lewis's liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma. So there are other considerations about the prior that show a religious context, but we need to address those. And we need to address those particularly for the miraculous because these are unusual events that we're ascribing. Second, just like what I said concerning motivation, the conclusion that a miracle was the result of a supernatural event is a further inference. Suppose that we grant that a report, like say the report of the raising of Jairus' daughter, is based on eyewitness testimony, is an accurate account of what the disciples saw. The Bible says that Jesus took Peter, James, and John in with him into the room where the girl was, and that he said, "Maid, arise," and he took her by the hand. And it also says that when they arrived, the people were all wailing and said that she was dead. Now, let's suppose that Peter, James, and John really saw that. We have a reliable account. The external facts are as reported. Still, the inference that she was actually dead is a further way in which those witnesses were accepting the evaluation of the servants, the people who were around her. She had been dead by the account of the story only for a short time. So the conclusion that this was indeed a miracle is a further inference, even though we take it for other reasons to be a reliable account of what the apostles witnessed. Thirdly, we subject the accounts of miracles to further investigation, because particularly when it comes to healing miracles, very often the accounts do not have detail that we would be looking for of the background or the further life of the person who received the healing miracle. So in many accounts, not all of them, but many of them, we don't have separate attestation that the person was already blind or already had this condition previously. And I'm having trouble thinking of any, possibly the story of the man born blind would count as a case where it follows the person then after the miracle to show that he didn't suffer a relapse or something of that kind. And I would say the man born blind is an exception on both of these counts. But take, for example, the woman with the issue of blood. It looks as though the disciples may never have met her again. So they didn't have the opportunity to inquire whether her healing was permanent, whether it was long-lasting. So for that reason, the stories, even if accurate, as far, again, as the external circumstances, lack some of the extra information and detail that we would often want when investigating healing miracles to rule out other possible explanations. And fourthly, and finally, a skeptic is definitely going to press the idea of a motivation for making up this story. And there would be several different people whom he might say made it up. He might say that the author made it up, and reliability definitely addresses that. He might say that the disciples made it up, and he might say that the person himself who claimed to be the recipient of a miracle faked it in some way in order to gain attention. Now, I'm not saying that these cannot be addressed, but I'm saying that they're not the kind of motiveless invention claims that we've seen in some other places. Like, why would John invent a temple cleansing early in Jesus' miracle? It's just out of the blue. We can at least make up a story that's got a little more plausibility about why someone might make up a miracle story about Jesus. For that reason, it needs to be addressed. I think it can be addressed, but that draws in the need to double down, zero down, and say, okay, but this is why I don't think that was invented by the author, by the disciples, or by the person involved if there was a recipient of the miracle. So these are reasons for us to try to examine miracle accounts in more detail and give answers. In the course of doing this, I will sometimes be concluding that a given account is too brief or contains too little information for that account itself to be answering all of the questions that we would want to have answered, or that we would ideally like to have answered. What this will mean is not that we're saying that it didn't happen, or even that historians are going beyond what the data warrant to conclude that it happened. This would mean that we would be going to a more indirect way of inferring it. So suppose we start out, which I do plan to do in the next video, talking about the central miracle, namely the resurrection of Jesus. And we believe that from that, we conclude, have really good historical evidence that Jesus was really who he said he was. Well, in that case, he had power to perform miracles. And then if you have an account, even a relatively brief one, of a miracle that comes from a reliable source, then you say, well, if you have a man and you've got this evidence that he really is God, and then you have a credible account of these external factors, then why not take that this was a miracle that he actually performed? Why shouldn't this be one of his miracles? But that's an indirect argument. And I think sometimes people mistakenly call that believing as a Christian, which gives it a sort of a fideistic sound. I think we should call it instead an indirect evidential argument. So I'll be distinguishing those and saying, in this case, I think we're leaning more on that indirect evidential argument. Whereas in this case, there's even more that we can draw out from the account itself that causes the account itself to be a particularly strong piece of evidence for the occurrence of this miracle, and that it really was a miracle. And so I'll be making those distinctions, but that doesn't mean that I'm calling the occurrence of the miracle into question, or even that I'm saying that it's something we have to believe in a special Christian way and not on the basis of strong historical evidence. Now, I haven't decided yet how many or which miracles I'm going to do. Two that I definitely plan to talk about are the resurrection, that for sure, and I hope that closer to Christmas time, I can do a sub-series on the virgin birth, because I think that's really exciting. Sometimes the virgin birth comes in for unnecessary question, in my opinion, and scholars will state that, well, we can know this as a Christian, but it's not really evidentially very well supported. And I think a lot more can be said for the credibility of the accounts in the Gospels of the virgin birth itself. And there will be others that I'm discussing as well, but I don't have a full list. So I hope that you will come along and enjoy this series and think of it in terms of what I've laid out here of historical methodology, which we will then see in action beginning with the next video on the resurrection. Thanks for watching.